we are now going to talk a little bit about some new and evolving standards in a DevOps world. And Ricardo will let's bring your camera on. And here's our intro slide. Ricardo and I work together at Parasoft, and we're going to talk a little bit about what we learned in today's sessions and just some of the issues that were kind of raised based on different things people said today. One thing I do want to point out, since there was a question about another standard, Ricardo and I talk about standards all the time, and we've done, a bunch of different videos. There's webinars, there's white papers, there's web pages about it. So if you've got questions about a standard, feel free to poke us and ask. If we haven't yet done a video on it, we're probably going to do it soon. But we're happy to, alter the order based on what people are asking for. So we're absolutely happy to go into that. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the slides off here because you're going to see our live faces. Why see our not live faces? And yeah, there we go. Is it still showing? No, we're good. Okay, so yeah, Ricardo, I wanted to recap a little before we dive into some of the new stuff. But we talked a little today about, we saw some people doing global development environment that's completely secure, running 24/5, if not 24/7, and 24/5 is really probably 24/6, right, given the time changes that people have. But pretty interesting to see a very challenging environment. We talked about how security fits into the process, and I think these days there's probably some new standards right around security anyway, right? Like, are we seeing safety without security anymore?
No, not at all. Actually, there's I wanted to touch on a little bit about the the whole CI/CD that Volkswagen brought up, and they've developed actually that whole pipeline, and they've got all the tools in place and the mechanism. And one other really important aspect to this is the organizational changes and following that agile methodology. So I'm sure there was probably something like Scrum or Kanban in the background, because you need to have the organization and the people also, along with the tooling and the pipeline, all in collaboration. So I think that was really interesting to hear the successes of that, but understand that there's also organizational aspects as well.
Yeah, and Ricardo, that's one of the questions that I hear kind of frequently, and you read it online and you hear it from customers and you hear it at conferences, is about the perceived tension between like lightweight agile development and a traditional V model software hardware development world. Like, can the two never ever meet? Are they enemies? Are they frenemies? How do you feel about it?
Yeah, there's a confusion around that. The compliance standards express, especially and for safety, they express a V model. They show a V model, and they talk about the different phases that you need to go through in development. And the important part is that it recommends that you go through these phases. And the V model is not a methodology that you need to apply. Some people kind of confuse it and think, oh, the standard says I need to do the waterfall. Not at all. Actually, the methodology is completely up to you. You can use a spiral, you can use agile methodology, or you can use the waterfall methodology based on should be based on whatever your project size is. For example, I've worked on very small projects with 1 or 2 people, and the waterfall works perfect. Very easy, quick communication, get those requirements done, and then we can implement those. Now, when you have large teams, an agile methodology is just the best thing to use hugely, and everybody's in parallel working together. So you have huge savings, and if you follow a DevOps kind of approach and a continuous integration, you're producing code that's safe, that's secure on all of these different iterations. So compliance standards, tell you what you should do, but they don't tell you how to do it. So that's the important aspect. So don't confuse those two.
Well, yeah, and I do think it's interesting because we are seeing, all over that people are adopting iterative methods, agile, scrum, etc., because it's helping them be more productive. It's helping them meet their requirements. And so, yeah, the methodology is the methodology. And what we saw, like with the previous demonstration, we just saw that the tools work well in the pipeline, right? They work in the tool chain that you have. They're agnostic really to process, right? Like, and in fact, the upcoming bonus session, the demo is going to show, C++ test in a really modern pipeline. So it'll be a fun thing for people to watch there. These practices are not at odds. I have literally heard presenters recently say that, Agile has no place in a safety critical environment. It's just not true anymore, right? It's certainly, if it's the right choice for what you're doing, then use it, right? And use
Exactly.
the environment that's the right choice for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's talk about some of these new standards that are coming out, Ricardo, right? Like we've got a new MISRA amendment.
Oh, yes. So we're hoping, that it gets announced at Embedded World, MISRA Amendment 3. So we're very excited about that. Of course, incorporates a lot of new safety and security rules, which, safety and security are always evolving. So that's really important. So we're looking forward to that, and come see us at Embedded World if you're attending, or come to our booth. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you wanted to talk about any of the other, there's so many standards right now that are coming out, especially in automotive. There's been, security standards, IEC 21434. There's the enhancements that are also coming out, especially next year. Next year is going to be a lot of new stuff coming out. For example, SOTIF, updates to SOTIF, updates to ASPICE. All because the autonomous driving, is just evolving like crazy. And you even have a little bit of competing standards like UL 4600, which is also for autonomous. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on around the automotive industry. And security, for example, DO326A for avionics, really, that was I actually enjoyed reading that particular standard. It was very enlightening, and I think some of the other industries can really adopt from the way they've approached it, because they have an abstraction level. So you have to look at security at the device itself, at the communication, all the ends, input and output ends to it, and make sure that those are secure, that the data is secure. And as you implement the code, that the systems and the subsystems communicate in a secure way. And even at the code level, when you write the code, write, set and get functions to make sure that when you are asked for data, that that party who's asking for that data has been verified, that is a legitimate request. And likewise, sending data out, make sure that it gets sent out to the right, and at minimum, at least do some encryption of that data to make sure if it is received, that data has been secured, so it can't be read if it's been hacked.
Yeah, and Ricardo, we recently did a webinar about 326A, and it was kind of fascinating, right? Because when you think back to the Lundberg days, crossing the Atlantic in an aircraft all alone, those days are over, right? Like, airplanes are never alone, and when they're in the sky, they're talking to a variety of systems. When on the ground, they're talking to a different variety of systems, and that's what we saw with 326. So, if you're interested in aviation, you can certainly go watch that. There's a web page, and you can watch the webinar. And if you can't find it, let us know. But I think the cars, right, we're now reaching the same thing, that the car can no longer just drive around on its own, right? It's communicating with navigation systems, and eventually there'll be, you know, V2V and smart cities and traffic control systems and all kinds of you know, infrastructure pieces.
Yeah.
And in fact, we're seeing new standards in automotive, right? And emerging and changing standards like you know, 21434 in support of UN 155. Maybe you wanted to talk about those a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. There's so many standards out there. There's standards for the AI code that's going to go on these autonomous vehicles. There's standards for just the battery technologies that are going on in these EVs. You know, but one of the most important aspects of automotive is the regulations. So you have, you know, UN WP29. And so now government or nations have gotten together and are regulating security for automobiles. So if you read those particular regulations, it talks about how you need to secure your component or your vehicle software, the communication aspects of it. And in turn, there's also subsections of it, like R155. So if you want to achieve certification, it talks about all the requirements that you need to satisfy. And there's R156 and R157, and those talk about autonomous in-lane keeping and so on and so forth. Now, those are really important because those are regulatory requirements that you need to actually satisfy. And then the compliance standards help you achieve or help you satisfy that. They talk about how to actually go about it. And you know, for like WP29, you have it'll mention using OWASP, it'll mention CWE, and it mentioned 21434. So all those other different standards that you should try to satisfy. So very, very interesting and exciting times that are happening right now in the automotive industry.
Yeah, if you know, if you do all this right, the standard should help you achieve the regulation, right? Achieve compliance, get your, you know, permission to do what you need to do, and help you, you know, succeed in an audit. And you know, the interesting thing about these safety and security oriented standards is that these aren't really bureaucratic regulations, right? I mean, they're all about building software that is more reliable, that is safer, that is less likely to fail. So it's not like, here's a thing, we're going to do it at the end. It's literally helping you build a better product, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, the other interesting thing about security is that you know, you have to do this threat analysis and risk assessment. And you know, they have these levels, security levels or cybersecurity levels. And based on those levels, you have additional requirements that you will need to satisfy. So we'll have like level 0, which is like basically there's no worry about security, and level 4, which is at the highest security critical level. And so you'll need to implement additional requirements. You'll need to apply OWASP, or you'll need to make sure that it's password protected, or there's a whole list of requirements. And it's interesting because it's a little bit different than safety. And with a safety, when you have a safety you know, assurance level, you have additional testing to perform. You may need to perform structural code coverage at not just statement, branch, MCDC, but perhaps at the object code level. So you have this different a different rigor that you need to apply. But in security, you got these regulations that you need to apply, additional regulations. And then to ensure that those security measures have been implemented, then you need to perform your verification and validation. And that includes things like pen testing or API testing, fuzz testing, and so on and so forth. So it's a very interesting dynamic, but they're like brother and sister to me. Security and safety, they complement each other, And you have teams now. You have security teams, and you have systems engineering teams that have been doing safety for a long time, and they're now working together to ensure that the system gets built properly, starting from the very beginning, making sure you gather all your regulations and your customer requirements and all types of requirements, and you proliferate all those requirements through the development of your system. So it's all happening, and CI/CD and DevOps, all of that is just a perfect solution for it all.
Well, you know, it's interesting because, yeah, when you take the regulations and they start to define what you're supposed to have achieved, and then the standards start to tell you how to achieve it, that we always end up with, okay, what do I actually do? And you start to get, for example, coding standards, which help you start to do safety and security earlier, right? So they're really helping you out, right? And there's also the other practices, right? Like, yeah, you should be unit testing. Yes, you should be measuring coverage, right? Like, I mean, I'm frightened to think of the idea of using, you know, some safety critical device and someone doesn't know what test coverage they have, right? It's a horrifying thought. So we've put a bunch of different like standards and regulations on the screen here. This certainly isn't a comprehensive list. It always gets really, really big, but we wanted to put some of the most common ones that people address, especially in the context of software development and software testing, right? But if we take a standard like 26262, right? Is it enough today with modern EVs and autonomous driving? Is 26262 going to get us there?
You know, 26262 is a fantastic standard, and it's gotten us quite far, but absolutely it's not enough. You have other standards like, you know, 21434 for the security. You have SOTIF 21448 for autonomous vehicles. And not only that, and the other thing is, as I mentioned before, you need to, not only does the technology and your products need to be safe and secure and address these other standards, address these other technologies, but the organization itself needs to change, needs to make sure that they are equipped to go out and be up to date on all the standards, all the regulatory requirements from governments. So you have things like ASPICE. And if you become certified to ASPICE, you're letting your customers know that you are equipped to handle all the latest regulations regarding security and safety. So that's a really important aspect as well. That you're collecting all your documentations, that you have all the processes in place, and all of the modern technology and processes in place to actually make you extremely competitive. So it's important to understand and have that aspect also as part of your belt.
Yeah, part of any, you know, regulated environment is keeping track of what you did and being able to demonstrate it, right? And the more that the tools and practices and infrastructure you put in place help do that for you, the better off you are. Mm-hmm. So, Ricardo, a couple of minutes ago you said something really, really funny, and I don't know how many people laughed at it like I did, but when you were talking about 326A, you mentioned that you really enjoyed reading the standard. And I'm betting that like a bunch of people out there don't enjoy reading new standards, and like if they're in automotive, they're going, oh my gosh, now I've got 21434. What am I going to do? I got 155 flying at me. What am I going to do? And like you've done enough of these that you're obviously not afraid of it. How should people approach it? If someone comes along and says, boom, here's another standard added to your mix, how do you approach it? What do you do? Why is it that you're not afraid of it? Why is it that you enjoy it?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is just my background. I've been a software engineer. I've developed software for safety critical, like, for example, train systems, San Francisco's BART. And so I've worked very closely with system engineers, and me at the time being a software engineer, you know, understanding that how to apply safety And then I also, I also, as I matured and evolved, I also needed to understand how to design systems, how to capture requirements, and actually be a systems engineer. And I think that aspect really helped me have a bigger scope of understanding. So the way all of my system engineering experience has helped me really understand how to tackle these compliance standards, because they talk about a lot of aspects that is related to systems engineering, like requirements gathering, talking to your customer, and making sure that the system you're building is really well communicated between you and your customer, and also your government, what regulations you need to satisfy, because if you don't get it right, you won't be certified, can't get that product out, it's going to cost you a lot of money. And so that V model that you've seen that I actually show quite often is huge, because it tells you the different phases that you should go through, which system engineers go through, and they take those requirements, they decompose it, they build logical architectures. From those logical architectures, they then move into a physical architecture, and they track and they link requirements to the design and all the way down to the code. And that's another fantastic part about Parasoft, is that we help automate all of this. We have integrations with ALM tools and like Polarian and Codebeamer, and some of them that were mentioned actually today. And you know, we help them with the verification and validation aspects of it all. So we're really helping customers throughout the whole software lifecycle, and that's really important, because that gives them the modern solutions that we're building today, and gives them a leg up and an advantage over our competitors. So yeah, Arthur here just put up some of these solutions that we have, and we have quite a few, because not only, just remember, we are, you know, not only supporting the embedded safety and security critical, but we're also supporting the IT you know, domain as well. And that's important, because you are now having the two mix. So in automotive, cars are connected. You can have your cell phone turn on your car, monitor its health, and do all kinds of other things. So, you know, so we're now using web applications and all kinds of other technologies and marrying the two. So we're really in a great position to serve our customers. So I think that this is fantastic.
Yeah, and you know, I think like when I read a standard, there are differences and nuances, and some are stronger in one area than others. But in general, when there are standards about safety or quality or reliability or security, it breaks down to what we should be thinking of as best practices, right? Which is, you know, we set out our requirements, we do a design, we think about the context of where we deploy it. We might call that hazard and risk assessment. We might call it threat and risk assessment, et cetera. We might call it ASIL. But it's think about what's going to happen and plan for it. And then we begin to implement the code. And so you have, you know, static code analysis and runtime analysis are part of most regulatory regimes. We have some runtime analysis. Some regimes are very, very strict about coverage and runtime testing. The unit testing, obviously, because you shouldn't be releasing something that hasn't been tested. But, you know, functional testing, non-functional testing. So, like, yeah, these basic best practices reach out through, you know, a commonality of the standards. And so you shouldn't pick up a standard and go, oh my gosh, I have no idea what they're talking about here. I don't know what they're asking me to do. If you just sit back and go, okay, maybe they wrote it funny, maybe it's in a weird place, but fundamentally, you have to, what are they asking me to actually do? And it's usually one or more of these things, hopefully more than one, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, those standards tell you what you should be doing, and a lot of them recommend or highly recommend. There are certain ones that will mandate, like in DO 178C particularly, but Yeah, it shouldn't frighten you. A lot of what you've done in the past, if you've been supporting safety critical, security critical, is mimics a lot of that. So just like Arthur said, instead of a hazard analysis and risk assessment, you do a threat analysis and risk assessment. So it's not as a big mystery. But there are nuances that are different, and becoming familiar with those is very simple and quick and easy. So yeah, I do enjoy reading these standards.
Yeah. So one question did just come up. I saw in the chat here, right? So someone's asking about, is there recording the presentation? Yeah, we'll be sending out a link where people can do it. And with that, we're kind of at the end of the main stuff here. If before anybody jumps off, there's a bonus session. It's an actual demo, and we got live Q&A available. So hang on for that. But just for those who do need to go, yeah, we're going to have a follow-up email with on-demand replay. If you want to schedule a consultation, a technical demo for you, there's that QR code on the left. We're going to be at Embedded World, booth H4.378, so there's a QR code to tell you more about Embedded World. On the right, we've got a webinar about DevOps CI/CD, software test automation for embedded. So, feel free to check those things out. And if you have to leave now, well, we're glad you joined us today. If there's other things you'd like to see, please, again, let us know, send us email info@parasoft.com, reach out to us on LinkedIn, Twitter, etc., and let us know like what you'd like to learn more about, what you'd like to see.